sharing about Elvis because I didn't want it ever to look like I was betraying him or our time together. And
there are women in Elvis Presley's life the world never got to meet. Not because they weren't important, not because they didn't matter, but because the story of Elvis, the one carefully packaged, sold, and protected for decades, didn't have room for them. They were edited out, quietly removed, their names scrubbed from the official record like they were never there at all. Diana Goodman was one of them. And if you've never heard her name before, that's exactly the point. Because Diana wasn't some fleeting fling or a groupie chasing fame. She was a woman who captured Elvis during one of the most fragile, desperate moments of his life, when his marriage to Priscilla was hanging by a thread, when the pressure of being the king was crushing him from the inside out, and when he was searching for something real in a world that had turned him into a product. Diana gave him that, and for a brief, dangerous moment, she made him feel like a man again instead of a myth. But here's the thing about loving Elvis Presley, it came with a price, and that price was often your erasure. So who was Diana Goodman before she became a footnote in a story the world was never supposed to hear? She was stunning, first of all, the kind of beauty that didn't need a spotlight because it commanded attention the second she walked into a room. Dark hair, sharp eyes, a smile that could disarm you before you even realized you were being charmed. But what set Diana apart wasn't just her looks, it was her presence. She moved through Hollywood and high society with a confidence that didn't beg for validation. She didn't need Elvis to define her. She had her own life, her own circle, her own sense of self. And maybe that's exactly why Elvis was drawn to her. Because by the time Diana entered his orbit, Elvis was drowning. He was trapped in a marriage that had become more performance than partnership. Priscilla had her own vision of what their life should look like, and Elvis, exhausted, lonely, misunderstood, was suffocating under the weight of it. He was surrounded by people who wanted something from him, his money, his fame, his approval. Everyone had an agenda. Everyone needed him to be someone. Diana didn't need him to be anyone. She saw him, not the sequined jumpsuits or the sold-out shows, not the brand or the empire, just the man underneath all of it, the one who was tired, the one who was searching, the one who was aching for something that felt honest. That's a dangerous thing to offer a man like Elvis, because once he felt that kind of freedom, he didn't want to let it go. Their connection wasn't loud or public. It couldn't be. Elvis was still married, still managing an image that had been meticulously constructed by handlers, publicists, and yes, Priscilla herself. Any relationship that threatened that carefully curated narrative had to stay hidden. So Diana became one of Elvis's secrets. One of the women he saw when the cameras turned off, when the crowds went home, when he could finally take off the crown and just breathe. And from what those close to Elvis remember, she made him come alive again. There were late-night dinners where Elvis would laugh, really laugh, the kind of deep, genuine laughter that had been missing from his life for years. There were stolen moments where he'd talk about his faith, his fears, his frustrations with the industry that had built him up and then refused to let him evolve. With Diana, he didn't have to perform. He didn't have to be perfect. He could just be Elvis Aaron Presley, a man trying to figure out how to live a life that had spun wildly out of his control. But here's where the story gets darker. Because the people around Elvis, the Memphis Mafia, the business managers, and especially those invested in maintaining his public image, knew that Diana was a problem. Not because she was bad for him, but because she was real, and real didn't fit the narrative. See, after Elvis and Priscilla's marriage fell apart, there was a very specific story that needed to be told to the world. Priscilla had to remain the love of his life, the one who got away, the woman who defined his heart. That story was clean. It was marketable. It kept Graceland's image intact and made sure that Priscilla's position as the keeper of Elvis's legacy stayed unchallenged. But Diana Goodman, she complicated things. If the world knew that Elvis had found real connection, real intimacy, real love with women who weren't Priscilla after their split, it would shatter the myth. It would prove that Elvis's heart didn't stop beating when Priscilla walked out, that he was capable of moving on, of finding happiness elsewhere, of building something new. And that truth was too dangerous to allow. So Diana was quietly erased, not violently, not dramatically, just removed. Her name didn't make it into the biographies, her face didn't appear in the documentaries. The stories about her and Elvis were dismissed, downplayed, or buried under layers of more acceptable relationships that could be framed as fleeting distractions rather than meaningful connections. She became invisible, a ghost in Elvis's story. A woman who loved him, who knew him, who saw parts of him the world never did, and yet she was never allowed to exist in the official record. And Diana wasn't alone. There were others. Gorgeous, intelligent, deeply caring women who crossed paths with Elvis during his loneliest years, women who gave him moments of peace, of joy, of hope. And every single one of them was quietly written out of history. Because the machinery around Elvis didn't just control his image while he was alive. It controlled his memory after he was gone. And that memory didn't have room for complications. It didn't have room for women who proved that Elvis's heart was bigger, messier, and more human than the legend could handle. So here's the question that should haunt anyone who thinks they know Elvis's story. What happened between him and Diana Goodman that was so explosive, even Priscilla didn't see it coming? And why was she erased so completely that most people don't even know her name? Because the answer to that question reveals everything you need to know about what really happened behind Graceland's gates. The first time Elvis saw Diana Goodman, he wasn't looking for love. He was looking for an escape. It was the early 70s, a time when Elvis's life had become a carefully orchestrated performance both on stage and off. His marriage to Priscilla was crumbling in slow motion, the kind of decay that everyone could see but no one wanted to name out loud. They were still appearing together publicly, still smiling for the cameras, still pretending that everything was fine. But behind closed doors, the warmth had gone cold. The connection had frayed. And Elvis, for all his fame and power, felt more alone than he'd ever been. That's the Elvis who walked into that room and saw Diana. And everything shifted. People who were there that night remember the change in him, the way his posture straightened, the way his eyes lit up, the way he suddenly seemed present in a way he hadn't been in months. Diana had that effect. She wasn't trying to impress him. She wasn't performing or posturing or angling for his attention. She was just herself, magnetic, confident, completely unbothered by the fact that she was in the same room as the most famous man in the world. And that drove Elvis crazy in the best possible way. Because here's what you have to understand about Elvis by that point in his life. He was exhausted by need. Everyone around him needed something. His fans needed him to be larger than life. His management needed him to keep performing. Priscilla needed him to fit into the polished, respectable image she'd envisioned for their marriage. Even his closest friends, the Memphis Mafia, needed him to be the guy who paid the bills, who made them laugh, who kept the party going. But Diana, she didn't need anything from him. She had her own money, her own life, her own circle of powerful, successful people who respected her for who she was, not who she knew. When Elvis started talking to her, she didn't melt. She didn't giggle or fawn or treat him like he was untouchable. She challenged him. She asked him real questions. She made him think. And for a man who'd spent years being worshipped but never truly seen, that was intoxicating. Their relationship began slowly, carefully, because Elvis knew the risks. He was still technically married, still under the microscope of public scrutiny, still managing an image that couldn't afford another scandal. So their time together happened in the margins. Late-night phone calls that stretched into the early morning. Private dinners at houses owned by friends who could be trusted to stay quiet. Stolen weekends when Elvis could slip away from the demands of his schedule and just breathe. And with Diana, he could breathe. People close to Elvis during that time noticed the difference she made. He smiled more. He laughed easier. There was a lightness in him that had been missing for so long, people had almost forgotten it existed. One member of the Memphis Mafia later said that when Elvis came back from seeing Diana, it was like watching a man come back to life. He'd walk in humming, joking, full of energy, like he'd remembered who he used to be before the world turned him into a monument. Diana did that for him. She reminded him that underneath the legend there was still a man who wanted to talk about books and faith and philosophy, a man who wanted to be challenged intellectually, not just adored from a distance, a man who craved intimacy, real intimacy, not the hollow praise of people who only saw his fame. She listened when he talked about his fears, about how trapped he felt in his own life, about how the industry had boxed him into a version of himself he didn't recognize anymore, about how Priscilla had grown distant, more interested in shaping his image than understanding his heart. Elvis didn't share those things lightly. He'd learned early on that vulnerability was dangerous, that people would use your pain against you if it served their interests. But with Diana, he felt safe. And that safety, that sense of being truly known, was something Elvis hadn't felt in years. There was one night, according to someone who was there, when Elvis and Diana were sitting together after dinner, talking about life and love and everything in between. Elvis was quieter than usual, reflective, and at some point he looked at her and said something that stuck with everyone who heard it. "You make me feel like I'm enough, just me. Not the show, not the name, just me." For a man who'd spent his entire adult life being everything to everyone, that was a confession. A raw, unguarded moment where the myth fell away, and what was left was just a man desperate to be loved for who he actually was. Diana gave him that, and in doing so she became dangerous. Because the people managing Elvis's life, his image, his career, his public perception, understood something that Elvis himself didn't want to face. Relationships like this one didn't fit the narrative. Diana wasn't a showbiz wife who could be molded into the Elvis brand. She wasn't someone who needed him or could be controlled by the machinery around him. She was independent, strong-willed, and fully capable of pulling Elvis further away from the carefully constructed world that kept him profitable. And that terrified the people who depended on Elvis staying exactly where he was. Priscilla, even though their marriage was over in all but name, still held enormous influence over how Elvis's life was managed. She had a vision for what his legacy should look like, and that vision required her to remain the central woman in his story. The tragic love, the one who knew him best, the keeper of his memory. But if Diana Goodman stayed in the picture, if she became known as the woman who made Elvis happy after Priscilla left, it would unravel that entire narrative. It would prove that Elvis moved on, that he found real love elsewhere, that Priscilla wasn't the defining romance of his life. And that couldn't be allowed to happen. So the whispers started, quiet suggestions that Diana was a distraction, that she didn't understand the pressures Elvis was under, that their relationship was complicated, too complicated, and that it would be better for everyone if it stayed quiet, private, hidden. Elvis resisted at first. He didn't want to let her go. But the weight of expectation, the constant pressure, the exhaustion of fighting for something real in a world built on performance, it wore him down. And slowly, inevitably, Diana began to fade from his life. Not because he stopped caring, not because the connection wasn't real, but because loving Elvis Presley meant existing in a world that didn't want you there, a world that would sacrifice your existence to protect a story that had already been written. The question no one's ever really answered is this: could Diana Goodman have been the one who saved Elvis? Could she have been the relationship that pulled him back from the edge, that gave him a reason to fight for a different kind of life? Or was she always destined to be erased? Just another inconvenient truth buried beneath the legend they were all so desperate to protect. Here's the thing about history: it's not written by the people who lived it. It's written by the people who control what gets remembered. And when it comes to Elvis Presley, that control was absolute. Diana Goodman didn't just fade from Elvis's life naturally. She was removed, deliberately, systematically, by a machine that had been running long before she arrived and kept running long after she was gone. A machine built on image management, legal agreements, and the quiet understanding that certain truths were simply too messy to allow into the official story. This wasn't personal, it was business. And the business of Elvis Presley required a very specific narrative, one that left no room for women like Diana. After Elvis and Priscilla's marriage ended, there was a choice to be made. Not by Elvis. He was too deep in his own pain, his own spiral, to see what was happening around him. The choice was made by the people who managed his empire, his handlers, his lawyers, his inner circle, and yes, Priscilla herself. They decided that Priscilla would be the story, the eternal love, the woman who defined Elvis's heart, the tragic romance that ended too soon but never really ended at all. That narrative was clean, it was sellable, it kept the mystique alive, and most importantly, it gave Priscilla a permanent seat at the table when it came to controlling Elvis's legacy after he was gone. But for that story to work, every other woman had to become irrelevant. Diana wasn't the villain in anyone's eyes, she just couldn't be allowed to matter. Because if the world knew that Elvis had found genuine happiness with someone after Priscilla, it would shatter the carefully constructed myth. It would prove that Elvis's heart didn't belong to one woman, that he moved on, that he was capable of deep, meaningful relationships that had nothing to do with his ex-wife. And that truth was dangerous. So Diana's name was quietly scrubbed. Not violently, not with drama, just with silence. She wasn't invited to speak at memorials. Her name didn't appear in the authorized biographies. When people asked about her, and some did, the answers were vague, dismissive, wrapped in phrases like just a friend or someone he knew briefly. The relationship was reframed as insignificant. a blip, a distraction during a difficult time. But the people who were actually there knew better. They knew Diana mattered. They knew Elvis cared for her deeply. They knew she was one of the few people who saw him as a man instead of a monument. But they also knew that saying so out loud would complicate the narrative. And in the world of Elvis Presley, complications got erased. This wasn't unique to Diana. She was just one name in a long list of women who loved Elvis and were quietly written out of history because they didn't fit the story that needed to be told. There were others, gorgeous, intelligent, deeply caring women who crossed paths with Elvis during his loneliest years. Women who made him laugh. Women who held him when he cried. Women who prayed with him, challenged him, gave him moments of peace in a life that had become chaos. And every single one of them was reduced to footnotes, if they were mentioned at all. Some of them signed non-disclosure agreements, quiet legal documents that came with financial settlements, and the understanding that certain stories would never be told. Others were simply ignored, left out of the official record, because acknowledging them would mean admitting that Elvis's romantic life was far more complicated than the sanitized version being sold to the public. Hollywood has always been good at this, erasing the inconvenient, rewriting the messy, turning real human experiences into branded mythology, and Graceland was no different. After Elvis died, the machinery only got more efficient, because now it wasn't just about protecting his image while he was alive, it was about controlling his memory forever. And that memory needed to be pristine, profitable, uncomplicated. Priscilla stepped into that role with precision. She became the gatekeeper, the voice of authority on who Elvis really was, what he really wanted, how he really felt. And to her credit, she worked hard to preserve Graceland, to keep Elvis's music alive, to build an empire that honored his name. But here's the cost. Every woman who didn't serve that narrative got erased. Every relationship that complicated the Priscilla as eternal love storyline got buried. Every piece of evidence that Elvis's heart was bigger, messier, and more human than the legend allowed, it all got locked away. Diana's story is just one example, but it reveals how the system worked. First, you minimize. She was just someone he dated casually, nothing serious. Then you redirect. Elvis was going through a hard time, he wasn't himself. Finally, you erase. Stop mentioning the name, stop acknowledging the relationship, let time do the rest. And it worked. For decades, it worked. Most people today have no idea who Diana Goodman was. They don't know her name. They don't know her face. They don't know that she made Elvis feel alive again during one of the darkest periods of his life, because her existence was inconvenient to the people writing the official story. And she wasn't alone. There were women who attended Elvis's final days, who held his hand, who mourned him in private, and were never allowed to mourn him publicly, because they were never supposed to exist. Think about that for a second. Imagine loving someone deeply, being part of their life in real, meaningful ways, and then watching the world pretend you were never there. Watching biographies get written without your name. Watching documentaries air without your story. Watching someone else claim the title of the love of his life, while you sit in silence, bound by agreements or simply forgotten by a culture that chose the easier story over the true one. That's what happened to Diana. That's what happened to so many women in Elvis's life. And the cruelest part? It wasn't just about protecting Elvis, it was about protecting the brand, the empire, the legacy that could be monetized, packaged, and sold to generation after generation. Because the real Elvis, the one who fell in love multiple times, who struggled with loneliness and longing, who needed connection more than he needed fame, that Elvis was too human, too flawed, too real. So they gave the world the legend instead, and the legend didn't have room for Diana Goodman. The woman who loved Elvis, for who he was never got to mourn him publicly. She was never allowed to tell her story. She was never given the dignity of being remembered. Because in the business of building myths, the truth is always the first casualty. And Diana Goodman was just one more truth that got buried beneath Graceland's gates, hidden, dismissed, and ultimately erased by the very people who claimed to be protecting Elvis's memory. But here's the thing about truth. It doesn't disappear just because you stop talking about it. It lives in the people who remember, in the stories passed down quietly, in the gaps between the official narrative and what actually happened. And sometimes, if you listen closely enough, you can still hear the voices of the women who were erased. Diana Goodman was one of them. and her silence speaks louder than any authorized biography ever could. So what does Diana Goodman's story actually tell us about Elvis Presley? Everything. Because when you strip away the myth, when you look past the sequined jumpsuits and the sold-out shows and the carefully managed public image, what you find is a man who was suffocating. A man who spent his entire adult life trapped between who he actually was and who the world needed him to be. And Diana, along with all the other women who were quietly erased from his story, represents the part of Elvis that was never allowed to exist in public. The part that craved genuine connection. The part that needed to be seen as human, not legendary. The part that was desperately searching for something real in a world built entirely on performance. That's the Elvis the official story doesn't want you to know about. Because acknowledging that Elvis found love, found happiness, found moments of peace with women who weren't Priscilla, it shatters the entire narrative. It proves that his life wasn't a tragic romance with one defining love story. It proves that his heart was bigger than the legend allows. It proves that he was messy, complicated, deeply human, and that the people around him spent decades trying to hide that humanity to protect a brand. Diana's erasure isn't just about one woman being written out of history. It's about what that erasure represents. The complete and total control that was exerted over every aspect of Elvis's life, even in his most intimate moments. Think about what that means. Elvis couldn't even choose who got to be remembered in his story. The women he loved, the connections he made, the relationships that gave him joy, none of it mattered if it didn't serve the narrative that had already been decided for him. He was the king, but he wasn't free. And that's the tragedy at the heart of Elvis Presley's life. He had everything the world thought he wanted: fame, money, adoration, power. But he didn't have the one thing he actually needed: the freedom to be himself. Diana gave him that, even if only for a moment. She let him be Elvis Aaron Presley, not Elvis the brand. She let him talk about his fears, his faith, his frustrations without judgment. She didn't need him to be perfect. She just needed him to be present. And for that brief window of time, Elvis was. But the machinery around him couldn't allow it to last. Because a man who finds happiness outside the carefully controlled narrative is a man who might start making his own choices. A man who might start questioning the system. A man who might start demanding a different kind of life. And that was too dangerous to allow. So Diana was removed. Not because she was bad for Elvis, everyone who was actually there knew she was good for him. But because she represented something the people managing his empire couldn't control. His genuine emotional freedom. That's what makes her story so devastating. Because it's not just about one relationship ending. It's about the realization that Elvis was never really allowed to have relationships on his own terms. Every woman in his life, every connection he made, every moment of intimacy, it all had to be filtered through the lens of public perception and brand management. Even his heart wasn't his own. And here's the part that should make you angry. This didn't just happen while Elvis was alive. It continued after he died. In fact, it got worse. Because once Elvis was gone, the people controlling his legacy had complete authority to decide which stories got told and which ones disappeared. They decided that Priscilla would be the eternal love. They decided that his other relationships would be minimized or erased. They decided that the complex, messy, deeply human Elvis would be replaced with a sanitized version that could be marketed to the masses. Diana's name was sacrificed to that vision, along with so many others. And the cruelest irony is that the real Elvis, the one who loved deeply, who sought connection constantly, who needed to feel understood, that Elvis would have hated what they did to his story. He would have hated the erasure. He would have hated the lies. He would have hated watching the women who loved him be written out of history like they never mattered. Because to him, they did matter. They mattered more than the fame, more than the money, more than the legend. But the legend was worth more. At least that's what the people in control decided. So what does Diana Goodman reveal about Elvis? She reveals that behind every piece of the official story, there's a hidden truth. Behind every authorized biography, there are chapters that were deliberately left out. Behind every documentary that frames Priscilla as the love of his life, there are women who loved him just as deeply, maybe more honestly, but were never allowed to speak. Diana reveals that Elvis's life wasn't a carefully crafted fairy tale. It was a battlefield between who he was and who he was forced to be. And the casualties of that battle were the people who actually knew him, who actually loved him, who actually saw the man beneath the crown. She also reveals something about us, about how easily we accept the stories we're told without questioning who's telling them or why, about how comfortable we are with mythology when the truth is sitting right there, just beneath the surface, waiting to be acknowledged. Diana Goodman wasn't a victim. She knew what she was getting into when she fell for Elvis. She understood the risks. She understood the reality, but her erasure, the deliberate removal of her name, her story, her truth, that's not on her. That's on the system that decided her existence was inconvenient. And every woman erased from Elvis's story is a piece of his humanity that was sacrificed to keep the legend alive. Every relationship that got buried is proof that the man himself mattered less than the brand that bore his name. That's the real tragedy of Elvis Presley. Not that he died too young, not that he struggled with addiction or fame or the crushing weight of expectations. The tragedy is that even in death, even in memory, he's still not free. He's still controlled, still managed, still packaged and sold to the highest bidder. And the women who loved him, who really knew him, they're still being erased, still being silenced, still being sacrificed to protect a story that was never fully true in the first place. Diana Goodman deserved better. Elvis deserved better. And we, as people who claim to care about his legacy, deserve the truth, not the myth. Diana Goodman is just one name, one story, one woman erased from Elvis's history. But there are more hidden relationships, buried truths, and secrets still locked behind Graceland's gates. If you want the real story, the one they don't want you to hear, subscribe now. Because what we're uncovering next will change everything you thought you knew about the king.